All right. Well, tonight we're very excited to be joined by Sam Assefa. He was director of the Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development from 2016 until this year. In addition to his time at OPCD, he has a wealth of experience in urban planning and design from cities around the country, having served as the senior urban designer for the city of Boulder, Colorado, deputy chief of staff to the mayor of Chicago, worked in both private sector as an architect and public sector as an urban designer in San Francisco. He's a graduate of MIT with a master's in city planning and the University of Chicago with a BA in architecture. He's going to talk for a few minutes and then he's going to take all of our questions. With that, thank you so much, Sam, for joining us.
Great, thank you. I'm on. Thanks, Patrick and Doug and the Urbanist for inviting me. It's a great independent forum and media, especially advancing good urban design and design discourse in Seattle. And organizations like yours are very important in so thank you. And I always enjoy participating and reading your work. I'm not going to say much other than just set up kind of a brief overview of where we are in the world of urban design and planning, and specifically the city of Seattle. And then hopefully we can have a robust conversation in terms of where the city needs to go, as well as what are the challenges and potential opportunities. As most of you have experienced, and all of us have experienced, 2020 was a significantly unprecedented time in so many different ways, but for the kind of work that we focus on, we care about, it is a great awakening about the importance of place, cities, from so many perspectives, from sustainability of cities, from an equity perspective, health, access to public spaces, any number of things. And as challenging as the time has been, what we've gone through and what we are going through still, we're not over that. I think it's really an important opportunity for transformative ideas to discuss about the kind of place our cities, our neighborhoods need to be and ought to be, in addressing a lot of the challenges that populations and individuals experience because of not only the pandemic, but a lot of the challenges of growth. As most of us know, pandemics or major disasters, whether it's fire or floods in the past, in the history of cities, have been important catalysts to really transform cities. London's underground and water system, or Chicago, a city that we know as one of the great planned cities, but for the fire, a lot of that would not have happened. So we are in those kinds of times now because of the pandemic. Specific for Seattle, I think some of the challenges we immediately saw had to do with, great access to outdoors and public spaces are really important for normal times, but it was clear during the pandemic, it was even more important, including public spaces such as the public right-of-ways and streets. It is also important that health performance of cities, whether urban heat island or pollutions in the places like the Duwamish area because of lack of either clean water or waterfront, or lack of trees or air quality, are also important components. So for the city, just before I go there, first of all, I did step down as of the end of March as Director of Planning for OPCD. The mayor had asked me to stay through end of June to help support some of her investments on sort of BIPOC communities. So I'm still sort of advising the city. But my previous office of planning, a lot of the work over the last year, while it focused on some of the immediate response, but it has done a lot of work in coordinating with other departments such as transportation, Office of Economic Development, to respond to some of the immediate challenges, including a lot of the land use analysis that we have done or supported from a GIS perspective, decisions around where streets ought to be either temporarily or permanently closed, or how you support small businesses by addressing, their outdoor needs. But at the same time, the office, because it's charged with a number of both long-term and current planning, including comprehensive plan, community plans, and urban design and land use work, most of the office's work is focused on long or immediate midterm projects. So in that, a couple of highlights I want to give is we've been doing a lot of work on the next update to the comprehensive plan. As you may know, every 5 to 7 years, city is required to update its comprehensive plan. And why the next update is really important is before even the pandemic, we focused primarily on first analyzing the comp plan itself from an equity perspective. Where since 1994, our comprehensive plan really has focused most of its growth, 75 to 80% on 18% of the land. So urban villages and urban centers. Those are still valid policies from a sustainability and environmental perspective. And that's where we should grow, where on the back of transit and the back of infrastructure. But there has been a question whether there is an inequitable distribution of land resources, public spaces, because of that decision. We don't know, but we started doing the background work from an equity perspective. For example, if you have significant amount of density in certain areas, does it have adequate access to public spaces compared to the larger part of our land, the single family zoned areas where per capita you would have significantly more outdoor space or other amenities. So then we jumped into 2020 as the pandemic came. That analysis combined with significant data-informed analysis my previous office has been working on around public spaces became really important, and how we integrate that either for long-term policy objectives as part of the comp plan, or to address some work on very specific communities plan areas, which I'll talk about briefly in which areas that we are focusing on from that perspective. From the equity analysis perspective, so we hired consultants to start looking at are the land use decisions disproportionately support or impact people of color, for example, from access to opportunity, access to amenities, those kinds of issues. So that work, the background analysis, which is not completed, but we've done a significant amount of that work, is going to help inform what major policy focus the next update should look at. It was also apparent, and I keep talking about public spaces, it was also apparent that we need to think about in the next update how we help transform not only the built environment, but the space in between. So are there policy objectives that we need to look at based on data and information around not only public parks, but any number of public spaces that are either city-owned, privately owned, owned by other institutions, and then improve their connectivity and access either through bikes or ped access so that people have easier access to them, and that distribution is equitable throughout the city. It is also going to look at how we address housing, which is an important component. The pandemic may have created some more interest in single family or more smaller towns, but my belief is that is just a temporary phenomenon. We still I think we believe cities are going to be and will be relevant. And so we have to address housing needs as the city grows. And we know, and we've done last year, some housing analysis, which is going to be an important component now in our comprehensive plan and some of the station area planning that will continue. But housing is going to be a very important element. Public spaces, housing, and then finally the quality of those spaces. So from that perspective, some of the key priorities for the 2021 comprehensive plan will include for this year to continue to finalize the equity analysis, and then get out to the public for engagement around hearing what key issues ought to be addressed with the next update. Comprehensive plan update does not address every policy in the document, rather what are we ready for the next 10 to 20 years based on the challenges and the problems that we see today and in the last few years. So there was an updated demographics and housing needs analysis that was completed. So we will build on that and then conduct some buildable lands analysis, which is a requirement of part of the comp plan update. In that buildable lands analysis, we would look at whether or not we have capacity for growth and where, based on current zoning, existing buildings. So it will look at every single parcel throughout the city and then project the likelihood of any parcel, whether having the capacity to be developed or not, or which areas should we still start thinking about for new land use designations as to accommodate our 20-year growth. That is also coordinated, as you know, with the region, with the county, and with the state to be consistent with their 2050 plan. And then coming down from the comprehensive plan, the office has community planning focus, very specific areas. In 2020, a lot of focus on light rail extensions. Some of the work has been substantially completed through agency workshops, working with Sound Transit, some developing design guidelines for 14 stations that will come in the city as part of Sound Transit 3 new station areas. There was an extensive work in community engagement, even through the pandemic, on 130th station. That is, where a new station is coming there, but the land use is currently really is not comparable to the kind of public infrastructure investment that is coming in that area. So we did the background work and engagement in the last year and a half, almost 2 years. Now in 2021, as part of the community planning, that will focus on very specific station area planning and potential zoning proposals. Some of it will go into the comprehensive plan as part of what is called the annual amendment, and then some of it will inform the next update, which is scheduled to be completed in 2024. We are initiating a new community planning in Westwood Highland Park as probably an 18-month process that will also look at ideas such as more access to amenities within the ideas such as a 15-minute neighborhood. So that area is conducive for that kind of analysis to address equity and access to opportunities for the neighborhoods there. Some of the other areas, a lot of focus on the co-planning with Sound Transit, station area planning in Jackson Hub, Westlake Hub, and including adding Delridge to that list. There was some analysis that was completed with LID I-5 as part of our urban design work. We may be looking at the downtown recovery, and some of the data and analysis from the LID I-5 study could help inform this year in some of the coordinations that we are having with Downtown Seattle Association, as well as the Downtown Transportation Alliance, as there's a lot of data and information in the LID I-5 study, and then a previous study that we conducted around Imagine Greater Downtown. So those ideas are going to be elevated in the immediate sense as part of our community planning, as well as some urban design work. New initiatives in the Northeast, in the Pioneer Square area for a coordinated initiative with King County to help improve the public spaces there. A new coordination with Office of Housing and Transportation at the SDOT on Baker Station area, as well as what is called the University of Washington laundry site, which the university transferred to the city. So we're having significant coordination there, both from an urban design perspective, but also potential housing development. Just a few other highlights. Last year, we launched the AD Universe, which is a tool to help residents and architects and others navigate through our accessible dwelling units process, but also about 10 pre-approved plans. My office and SDCI, Seattle Department of Construction and Inspection team work together to hire architects and develop pre-approved designs. That is to make accessory dwelling units and increasing capacity even in single-family neighborhoods for more housing types as we move forward. And then a few rezones for affordable housing in Rainier Beach. And then to tee us up for the next work, significant amount of housing analysis. Most of it is not new. You know, a lot of the missing middle is still the biggest challenge that we have in terms of housing type that we need to address either through legislative and zoning to increase most of that, the townhouse types and what we consider as the missing middle housing, even units on the ground floor of commercial spaces and other places where we can include that. There has been a significant engagement and work in the maritime industrial area. This, as most of you know, had stopped and started over the last few years. And there was an extensive engagement through that, very controversial in terms of the balance between how much land should be really dedicated and protected for industrial and manufacturing and job creating uses, as well as whether that area is conducive to address some of the housing type that we need. So those are some of the highlights. There is a lot of work with the separate equitable development initiative program that has been developed in Office of Planning and Community Development. We have close to 60 organizations that we're working with through around $36 million of funding that we provided for neighborhoods in Rainier Beach, Chinatown International District, the Central District, the central area for ideas and developments that they propose so that they could actually address some of their needs, whether it's a community center or childcare, but developments that actually they believe are anti-displacement projects. That work is going to expand this year and be coordinated as part of the larger recovery discussion that we're having. One interesting opportunity that we are exploring is what an equitable transit-oriented development would look like as we look at our 14 station areas and look for opportunities for land ownership for especially people of color who haven't had those opportunities for many, many years. It's one thing to have affordable housing and you rent it. It's another to have ownership of land in terms of community wealth building. So ideas around equitable development, equitable transit-oriented development, which incorporates potential land acquisition and land ownership to target those our populations that haven't had access to those opportunities. So those are kind of some of the highlights. I know I talked more than 10 minutes, but I just want to open it up with those and then have a robust conversation. I'm pretty sure you'll have many questions and ideas as well.
Great, thank you so much for that wonderful overview. So from looking through your bio, you've lived in Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, Boulder, and probably a number of other cities. So how does Seattle compare? And what are some things you think that we're really doing right and that you want to share with the world? And what are some things that you wish we would adopt from other cities?
That's a good question. In fact, one of the lessons that I've learned from working and living in other places, at Rome, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, to those, for some reason, I just have moved around many cities. I think one of the interesting lessons that I have learned is the challenges and the problems in some ways are the same. The solutions have just to be local in many ways. And then that's one. And the second is it is also shaped by the decisions are informed by the political structure, and to a certain extent, even with the city culture, whether it's Boston in the East Coast or Chicago, has a very different history and culture around city building from West Coast cities. We've also done a lot of comparison within West Coast cities between Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and Vancouver. That's been one of the key work over the last 5 years in my office, sort of comparing notes similar to the questions that you're asking. So what Seattle is doing well is, I think there is, just like yourselves, there is the passion and interest to engage land use policies by the citizens. There's a significant amount of engagement. People are well informed for the most part, comparatively, in other cities. Chicago, for example, there's less really community engagement around. You don't have hours of meeting with the planning commission, and there's some engagement within the community groups, but some of the decisions are made on the back of a good backbone of a planning infrastructure. So Chicago has, for the last 60, 70 years, and even its current development is really built on the back of a really well thought out plan of Burnham's. Seattle is catching up. So even though there's the intention and the passion, we don't have that really wonderful backbone of a city. We are building it as we go along. So some of the challenges are on infrastructure. As the city is growing really fast, the infrastructure that is catching up is difficult. You've heard the Seattle process is extensive. We fight on every little thing. That doesn't happen as much, relatively as much in other areas. There was at one point comparing San Francisco and Seattle, which San Francisco and Chicago, which is the question about, is an extensive engagement, does that result in better city and better outcome compared to where you have many decisions made at a much faster pace around city building? There are pros and cons to that. There's analysis paralysis here, and the challenge in this time that we're in, we need to be so agile in decision and just move much faster, especially in city building. By the time you get everybody to agree on an idea, the problems have changed and your solutions are already too old, and you start from scratch. My experience in Chicago has been, you do the work, get it done, and then if it works, then you make it policy and then you expand on it. If it doesn't, you haven't done much damage, then you move on. So, and then the political structure is a whole other issue, which will take a long time to discuss. But on balance, I think the process is the biggest issue that I see for Seattle. That we don't have time to keep taking 5 years of community planning. The solutions that you come up with are already too old for the problems that you're trying to solve by that time.
Oh, that's great. So you just finished your time at OPCD recently. Looking back, what do you think what are the things you're most proud of? The
Um,
biggest successes?
Yeah, let's see if I short one sort of building the team and the structure of OPCD, and part of the reason that it was created is to have more agile decisions, to be agile. I think we've shortened. It's still long. We've shortened some of the time that it has taken us to do community planning. We've done it in some cases in 9 months, in 18 months. Although we get stuck in the political process before implementing it, but the actual work has been completed. I think with all its challenges and problems, implementing the citywide rezone for the mandatory housing affordability program, which my office led in coordination with other departments, I thought that was a great achievement as an office. That expanding the discourse about the importance of land use is not just great buildings and great development and density, but equity is an important component of it. And once we established the Equitable Development Initiative with an Office of Planning that has a land use component to it to a certain extent, initially more of as an economic development. Now that team is integrating very much with our urban designers, with our land use design planners, for example, addressing a rezone of a lot of our areas for affordable housing is engaged. That team is engaged with our Equitable Development Initiative team from the perspective of how we create equity through land use decisions. And so our current focus, for example, is how do we do the layers of basically racist land use policies that have created the patterns and the economic disparities directly related to ownership. That team is now engaged with our urban designers and land use and zoning policy group with our economic development focus staff to address what I called an equitable transit-oriented development. So the integration of that. So I'm proud of that engagement and a bit transformation in terms of how we think about land use policies. In Seattle, this goes to your question previously. I think we're very good at raising the issues as a culture here. And this, long before equity has been fashioned, I think the city, long before I came here, has been, talking about it. I think it's time to really put it on the ground now. And that's what I'm actually excited about, how once we get over sort of the political infighting in the next administration, I think it's my office and others are really having discussions about how do we, prepare for a new administration to embrace a lot of these ideas for transformative ideas in terms of land use policies and planning.
That's a good segue, because I was about to ask you about, and you came in, it seems like right at the end of the last comprehensive planning process, and you're leaving right as the new one's starting. And then you were there during one of the greatest times of growth in Seattle in its history. And what do you think are some of those transformational ideas that we should try to make sure get into the new comprehensive plan? And what do you see the opportunities in that plan?
I think some of the work that we have done around being data informed in our decision is an important one for land use. So to give you an example, we have moved more and more to more of a three-dimensional analysis. It's not new, but it is new for city policymakers in terms of really understanding the built environments from multiple data perspectives. So one example, and I think one of the most successful programs, you may not have seen it as open, that the data and the information now is being shared, is how we quantify and analyze our public spaces within the city. And some of the work that our staff has done and developed from a data perspective is helping inform the Parks Department and SDOT and SPU in the way we help coordinate creation of new public spaces and or improving the existing ones that we have. The focus on agility, for example, instead of a long-term plan, let's make it an action plan that also has outlines the step-by-step implementation in it incrementally. For example, the Duwamish action plan for the Duwamish area, it was one of the pilots that we started within Office of Planning and Office of Sustainability, that we create an action plan that has very short-term, 6 months, a year, 2-year, 5-year, 15-year implementation actions. So those actions are being implemented as we speak, while also keeping in mind the long-term vision for that area. So a lot of changes around those kinds of coordination, that we don't work in a silo. That's a challenge in Seattle in general, historically, that those silos have been broken down to a certain extent, at least among the teams that have been working together as part of interdepartmental teams. Did that get to your key question today?
I think so. I think that got some of it, like what we should be trying to look for in the new comprehensive plan.
I think a serious understanding that we have significant amount of land. We can address some of the challenges around housing, especially not only public spaces, if we're really smart about the leverage that we have as a public agency to use those tools to maximize opportunities for multiple types of housing. It's not just what the market could provide, but we need to work with the private public sector coordination, some of the technology around either prefab buildings or any technology that really expedites and increases capacity, the number of housing that we could build, the time it would take to build it, but also potentially the cost as well. So we need to have policies at the comprehensive plan to help advance those, and then quickly bring it to the ground with very specific actions, things like the maximizing, even in our single-family neighborhoods, even with the right scale, maximize the opportunities for multiple types of housing. You don't have to build mid-rise and high-rise everywhere, that you can maximize the utility of the land that you have with creative design solutions. So the ADU, the direction the ADU accessible dwelling unit is going, and the removal of some of the barriers, including increasing the capacity, are important, I think, components that need to be advanced moving forward.
Great. You touched on this a little bit earlier as well. Like, what do you think it means to try to plan for equity or incorporate equity into our planning? And what does an anti-racist urban design look like?
Let's see if I can pull images, but I think that's the last question, what anti-racist planning look like. So if you look at, and what was really wonderful about the 2035 comprehensive plan, was, I don't know if most of you are familiar with it, this data-informed mapping around displacement risks and access to opportunity. The displacement risk, for example, looked at which areas are more prone to be displaced based on price, proximity, and a number of other data points. So that heat map, when you look at that heat map, and then you have a heat map, different shades for access to opportunity, it shows you which areas have less access to opportunity, which areas are going to be most likely to be displaced. Those same maps are exactly the same as the maps from the 1920s and 30s of redlining and places where people of color were actually either by law or by covenants, private covenants, were excluded to be have access. In central area is the poster child. That's the area that African Americans are allowed to live. They can't, in any area, they can't own property. So when we superimpose those maps I talked about in 2035 that we developed, they look exactly the same. So that map needs to change over time. And the people that are impacted and the demographics actually reflect that as well. So those patterns are long lasting. The decisions from exclusionary zoning and things like that. So the question is, how do we reverse that as we move forward? Now we know the challenges and problems. So some of the solutions to that is really obviously some legislative based or zoning. Recently, based on state law, we took properties owned by religious properties, religious entities, and rezone them and give them capacity, even if they're in single family neighborhoods. So, and those happen to be mostly owned by Black clergies and others. So now they have an opportunity to maximize the utility of the land to create wealth. I mentioned Equitable Development Initiative. And the reason we were able to make that legally an area that we can target is by using those maps that I talked about. If you come from those areas and have ideas around solutions for anti-displacement by developing, things like 90 units of housing that the Ethiopian Community Center is planning to build in their community center. Well, that area is both in the area of lack of access to opportunity and potentially at risk of displacement. Well, we are able to actually allocate funding and build their capacity, and they will be able so that map will change over time once they have access to that. And there are a number of stories like that. And then moving forward, I think that some of the greatest opportunities are the 14 station areas that billions of dollars are going to be invested, where public money will be invested. Well, those are the areas that we should focus in changing that map by creating opportunities for ownership. The other area is really understanding what barriers there are with the existing zoning. So actually my staff worked on analyzing even MHA, mandatory housing affordability. Well, we saw in the central area, even though the up zone is wonderful, most of the African-American developers have really a high challenge in getting that delta because MHA requirements, they can't get to the end. So how do we remove some of the barriers that are specifically affecting them? So it's those kinds of questions I think we need to explore and reverse, some of those previous decisions over time.
Excellent. Something else that I think has come up for me is part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and for many of us, is the tendency of urbanism and urban design to always look to Europe, to always look to Barcelona, Copenhagen, the cities like that. You mentioned living in Nairobi and Addis Ababa.
Yes.
Sorry, my apologies. In your experience, are there lessons that Seattle could be learning from Africa and from Latin America and from Asia, and or urbanists and urban planners in general, things that we could be incorporating?
Yes, I think, first, before I say that, I think what's really important is really understanding what are those components that are really working there, and then how is it relevant to the kind of life that we live here, the kind of place that we have, environment, and all that. So some of the lessons, I think, looking at other places, especially developing countries, and I was in Addis Ababa and, Mombasa, but Addis Ababa last November. And it is phenomenal how fast it's growing. And it has a lot of lessons it needs to learn from here because of the pressure they just build pretty much everywhere. But the flip side is you'd have a building and you'd have people putting out and drying their food outside. It's a high rise. They might have a store on the 7th floor next to a residential unit. The building is there's no differentiated, but the activities are all kinds of activities that you can imagine. So that segregation of uses is not almost non-existent in some of them. So you can have commercial activity and you're next door to your living quarters, and somehow people find some kind of cohesive way of existence. But I think we need to think about, especially now. So if our office spaces are going to be used, hopefully, a little less than before because of the changes in, working 3 days in the office, 2 days. So are there opportunities to use those spaces for other activities? I think human nature is that you gravitate towards a lot more mixed and a lot less segregated areas. So in most of the developing countries, and Charles Landry, he's an English thinker about city planning, as well as a practitioner who actually coined the term the creative class long before Richard Florida, talks about this, that the cities have to be for the world, in that anywhere you go, anyone, because of the nature of the world changing, should be comfortable. The spaces should be comfortable for, a Muslim want to be able to pray during any time. So our your public spaces accommodate that in subtle ways and design. Or cultures that actually favor the porch and the front porch of their building in their house in the street as a place of engagement activity, versus a culture mostly of ours here, which is the private space in the backyard. So how to design and regulations in terms of how you use those spaces should be really open to address multiple cultures and places, so that the places are comfortable for people to be. So the city for the world, those kinds of changes, I think. But and the similar issue, I saw some amazing parks at the scale that I could not have imagined, that are built, new ones, and in Addis Ababa, for example, and they're interwoven with some of the highest density places there, but they give significant amount of relief for the places. Human beings really haven't changed in terms of the scale and the way you interact with the place wherever you are. But the key is, what are the relevant issues? And even the idea about 15-minute neighborhood. Well, what does it mean in Westwood Highland Park versus in downtown or Wallingford? So the solutions, the idea might be the same. The solution, one area you may just need some grocery stores and cafes. In other areas, you may be needing job creation and daycare and others, so that those are their daily needs based on the sort of micro nature of those areas. So it's those kinds of things, I think, that are important to learn from other places and make it relevant to to the place here, both culturally, economically, and certainly sort of politically as well.
Oh, that's great. I really like that part about public space that someone like a Muslim woman would feel comfortable praying in, and that's a real good bar. You touched on 15-minute cities as well. How do you think that's a real hot topic right now, and I know the mayor has touched on that as well. How do you think Seattle should embrace that concept?
We already do it in some of our areas where, I mentioned urban villages and urban centers, where you concentrate most of the density in commercial activity as well as residential. But not all areas have those kinds of access. So the whole concept of 15-minute city, it helps to get people sort of to think new. It's not new, it's an old concept, as we all know. Older, well-established cities are the most, integrated and dense, but also with all amenities within walking distance or bike distance. Seattle should embrace it and expand. I think I'll go back to some of the opportunities are in the 14 station areas, but also asking a question in our sparsely populated areas or our less dense areas of single family neighborhoods. What does a 15-minute neighborhood in that area look like? you have to address topography and other issues. That how do you introduce more of the needs with less distance or less reliance on the private auto. Public spaces are, of course, one of them, but there are lots of amenities that need to be introduced. Sometimes the zoning is a barrier, and other times it's economics, because we are in a market economy. In China and command economy and other places, you can actually demand it and make it happen, that you have to have a grocery store every so often or subsidize it. Here, the market has to do it. The market is not going to do it if you don't have the right rooftops within a certain distance. You know, a small corner grocery store, a mom and pop grocery store would need probably 25 to 30 dwelling units per acre within a quarter mile. So if you don't have that, you can have the wish and you can have the zoning for that area, it's not going to happen. So really understanding those right levers for each neighborhood and area. And this is even more important now. Again, I go back to the pandemic. You know, if you have stay-at-home orders, wouldn't it be great to have within your immediate distance where you have a relief, not only to get outside, but you don't have to go too far to get what you need for, you know, food or other amenities, because you could just walk there and get it. So.
Thanks. You touched on this as well a little bit, but there was a question from the audience about what kind of long-term changes in architecture or public spaces, like, you know, outdoor, well-ventilated gathering spots and like the equitable distribution you've talked about, do you anticipate due to COVID? They threw out the example of Mumbai's embrace of light and air after plague. And do you think there'll be big changes in our city?
I think there has been a lot of conversation, especially with our parks department and ASDOT, around expansion of, or the rethinking of what public spaces are. If that's what the question is, this in the notes?
It was a question someone threw in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can send you the link in terms of an extensive analysis our staff has done to quantify how well our existing places work, even the private spaces. And there, it's really understanding what the design elements are important to make them welcoming, so that you don't feel like it's a public private space. But in terms of addressing pandemic, I think my thought is both large public spaces, but smaller spaces that are obviously well ventilated, but they are outdoors. And in inclement weather, do you have enough shelter, shed, or something else that you can continue to use those spaces? In Seattle, most of our problem is, you know, light rain for a while. That is not hard to protect. So do those public spaces have the right amenities? And some of them do, but most of them really don't. And really understanding what do we need to do to encourage more people to have easy access and use of those spaces. Ventilation, that's a challenge if, you know, you're confined in, if you have lack of space in some of the dense areas. What, you know, places like Barcelona, what they have done at one point is actually in every street intersection chamfer the area, you know, big chamfers, so that in its totality, then you have a major, wonderful opening there in a very, very high density space, even though that area serves either as a roundabout, but it's also a place where light and air can flow much, much easily, even though it is a very high dense area. I don't see that happening in, you know, undoing existing structures here, but if the opportunities or the diagram is there, as things change or you tear down and build, if you have a diagram that where those places should happen or those kinds of actions should happen, I think that gives the roadmap for that. I would encourage you to look at the work that we've done for Imagine Greater Downtown, where
Oh,
we have
wow.
identified certain fantastic opportunities where there's a lack of those kinds of public spaces and an opportunity when and if that comes. So that gives you some roadmap in terms of, and those are data informed. So it addresses environmental issues, air quality issues as well, just by the introduction of enough um, trees, plants, but also open air space within those areas. Our downtown in general, I feel, compared to other cities, lacks enough public space and amenity. And part of it is, in our previous and long-term zoning, we didn't really capture the value from that increased density to really transfer it to making sure that those areas are protected. And this would be important in, for example, West Lake Station. That's going to be one of the most important hubs in the city from a transportation perspective. It's a high density area, but public space is going to be incredibly important in that area to be commensurate to the amount of density that area and will take in the future because of the transit infrastructure.
Thank you. I really hope the next mayor takes up the Imagine Downtown plan. I know there was so many good things in that. I know we're almost out of time and you're on the East Coast, but I did want to sneak in one question about regionalism. I saw you speak, you moderated a Urban Land Institute panel recently on mega regions.
Oh yeah.
But it made me think about how beyond mega regions, Seattle doesn't function very well as a region, even though we're dealing with many of our low-income residents being displaced to the South King County, yet commuting into the city. We've got commuter vans and buses taking tech employees back and forth across the lake. It seems like we're still very siloed. How do you feel like we're doing on that level, and how do you think we could improve working together more coherently as a region?
I think the regional coordination is happening to a certain extent, but it just gets stuck on sort of a policy level of the sort of the policy wonks within PSRC or within planning in some of the state. It's really getting it on the ground and showing demonstrable outcomes. The biggest challenge, I think, is because of the income gap and affordability issues. When we are becoming more of a service sort of industry, the workers are way out there and they commute long distances, but we don't create enough opportunities for them to actually be close to where they work. Ideas like the UW Mount Baker Station area and the type of housing that is created, or potentially, expansions of maker housing in our industrial area. I think jobs are really critical, important for the maritime industrial area, but opportunities for people who, most of them who work there, cannot afford to live in the city, and other opportunities for creating that and minimizing their long-term transportation. There has been a great conversation with Downtown Transit Association over the last 2 to 3 years in its new mission to really think about the transportation. Its focus is around downtown, but most of the downtown clients also come from long distances, including, people who work at night in the service sector or hospitals and other places. So the integration of conversations around both the land use and the transportation and those kinds of regional integration and coordination are going to be significantly important. I have, sorry to focus on the downtown, but the alignments that came together in creating the Imagine Greater Downtown that took, Sound Transit, King County Metro, Downtown Seattle Association, private businesses there, SDOT, OPCD, and the port. So that some of them who've been here for quite some time have expressed that this is the first time these agencies collectively came together to have a vision for a downtown for the first time in Seattle. I think that is important because they have ownership around that. And some of the members and the executives have committed, for example, to help advance the ideas developed in Imagine Greater Downtown. So that is a regional coordination to really address the living room for the region, which is the Seattle downtown. So those kinds of ideas in different parts of the city, and we're doing it with the Duwamish Valley area, actually. Our team is coordinating significantly with, including with the port and other regional agencies. So it has to happen at all levels. We do well in the comprehensive plan level because partly it is required by the state that you have to bring that to the ground in terms of coordinated implementation of projects that really have impact both locally and regionally. And the two most important ones that I can think of are obviously housing, actually three: housing, jobs, and transportation.
Great. Well, like I said, I want to be respectful of your time, but one final question. Now that you're wrapping up in June from OPCD, what's next? Or are you still going to be doing something in the Puget Sound, or are you off to another exciting city?
Well, that's yet to be determined. One thing I'm looking forward to is taking some time off, but I'll be continuing to do what I do. Once I know, you'll be the first to know. Yeah, I will know soon, but I'll be around for a little while, not that long.
All right, so we'll look for you in the some other exciting city. It sounds like a great time to take some time off. COVID hopefully will the vaccine and some of the lifting of restrictions will allow you to enjoy some travel. Looks like you're already.
Yeah, it's already done that, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time tonight and for answering questions, and also for your many years of service to the city, the people of Seattle. We all appreciate it.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for you as a group. I think every city needs organizations like you to really advance the discourse and also to hold city's feet to the fire and on some of these issues. It's really important because it has an impact in terms of advancing the cause.
Great. Well,
thanks so much for saying that. Yeah, we appreciate that.
Thanks, Doug. And thank you, Patrick. Appreciate the conversation.
All right. Have a good night.